friends! Welcome to the Sanctuary Sewing Workshop. I'm Leah, and I'm the person who designed this sewing pattern for you right here in my home studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm so excited that you're here and ready to sew your own flowy, feel-good jumpsuit. I tried really hard to design the Sanctuary jumpsuit to really flow with you and your movements. Whether you're twirling your booty out on the dance floor or you're just wearing it around the house on a Saturday, I think you'll find that it's roomy where you want it to be, it's fitted where it counts, and I tried to pack it with a lot of thoughtful details like sleeve ruffles and a super comfy elastic waistband, inseam pockets, and a really clever button back closure that I think you're going to find way more comfortable than a zipper. By the end of this sewing adventure together, I'm really hoping that you'll end up with a jumpsuit that really fits both your body and your lifestyle, something that's a source of awesome energy for you at your next event that you wear it to, not something that drains you throughout the day and you can't wait to take it off. Before we dive into the project, I just want to help with our mindset a little bit. So this is just a reminder that this is not about perfection. It can be about creating a new garment that you really love to wear, but it also can just be a fun process of making something with your hands. If you were just here for the finished jumpsuit, you could have easily just bought it over in my shop, but instead you decided to show up and get that more personal mind-body connection with your garment. And I think it's gonna be so fun, so worth it. I'm proud of you for diving in, and if you're at all feeling a little bit nervous to cut into your fabric, remember that fabric is meant to be used. I really don't believe that there's any fabric that's too precious to cut into. And if you really do think that yours is, go ahead and make a super simple bare minimum sample garment first using like an old thrifted bed sheet, and that'll take a lot of pressure off trying to get it perfectly right the first time. I very rarely make anything perfectly the first time. And remember too that mistakes are just part of the process. I have made plenty and I still continue to. Although I will say the more you sew, the more few and far between those mistakes get. So just think every time you make a mistake on this project, you're just getting one step closer to a more streamlined sewing experience in the future. For now, I think you can just consider the creative problem solving a really fun part of the sewing process. So if you hit a snag, just take a deep breath, step away from the project for a second, drink some water, give yourself a little stretch, and come back with some fresh eyes. You've got this. I believe in you. You're gonna make something really cool or something dumb. Either way, if it's dumb, we can laugh about it in the end. If it's cool, we can all applaud. Either way, it sounds fun to me. So I'm just excited to have you here and I can't wait to dive in. In this workshop, I've broken it down into super simple bite-sized steps so that you can follow along with me at your own pace. I know some of you are hardcore and you want to whip this out in one day, and some of you want to really take your time. You could drag this out for an entire month if you wanted to. There is no right or wrong pace. Either way though, I do really recommend that you grab the sewing prep checklist, which is linked somewhere on this page. This checklist is going to help you clump certain tasks together and give you cues about when's a good time to take breaks so that you don't get overwhelmed or burnt out during the project. Before we depart into the magical land of the sewing workshop, I just want to outline for you real quick what we're going to be covering. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the key design features and customization options that we have on this garment so you can make a more informed decision about which design elements you want to piece together for yours. Then we'll head over to your pattern instructions, where I'll tell you more about the tools and fabric and notions that I recommend. And after that, we'll dive into how to prepare your paper pattern, how to get your body measurements so you can choose the correct size on the size chart, and how to do customizations by height using my height adjustment calculator. After that, we'll talk about how to cut out the pattern on the grain line of your fabric. Once we've got everything all prepped, we will finally be constructing our garment. I've got all of the sewing instructions broken down for you step by step in video tutorials and written and illustrated instructions. Of course, you're welcome to just jump into whatever section you need, or feel free to follow me through from start to finish. It's Totally up to you. And please, 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 pretty please, please, pretty please, we would love to see what you make with this sewing pattern. Once you're finished, I invite you to upload a picture of your final garment over in the Sanctuary photo gallery, where you can also add little notes about what kind of design tweaks you made along the way. Please don't be afraid to post your photos here. This is a super safe space. We're all going to love what you made. We're all going to be so proud of you. We're all in the same boat of creating this cool jumpsuit. And so by uploading a photo and maybe a note or two about what you did, you can really help inspire other sewists who are learning right alongside you. All right, I'm so excited to work on this sewing project with you. I hope this pattern brings you a little bit of joy, a little bit extra sewing confidence, and ultimately just a jumpsuit that brings you really good energy when you wear it. So let's go pick our design, grab our fabric, grab a nice little cozy drink, and let's make something cute together. You've got this. All right, let's start off by taking a look at all of the different design elements of the jumpsuit. I think this is really helpful so that you know when you're going into the project what exactly you're going to be making. And that way you can also see where you might want to switch up different design elements to personalize your own jumpsuit. So let's start at the bodice front up here at the neckline. We have a V neckline that comes to about mid-chest. Now on the one that I'm wearing right now, I actually lowered the neckline down by I think about like 1.5 inches-ish, and that gives me a little bit more of a deep V. So that's one spot where you could hack the pattern to make it a little bit different. After lowering it on my sample though, I will say I decided that I like the original pattern depth better. So that's something for you to consider and play around with. The bodice neckline is an awesome place to play around with adding a little bit of a faux fringe. So if you're working with a fabric that has a really nice selvage edge, that's the edge that's already bound by the manufacturer. Sometimes it can actually be really pretty. And so I will show you in the tutorials how to sort of integrate that edge if you want to achieve a more faux fray, high texture detail here right on the neckline. As far as the bodice shape, we're working with what's called a dolman sleeve, and that just means that the bodice and the sleeve are all one piece, which makes it super easy to sew, and that's what kind of gives us this more of a flowy, kind of almost pseudo bat wing sort of shape to our underarm and our sleeve here. And that makes it super comfortable around the bust line and doesn't get too restricting in your armpit area. And then at the end of our sleeves, we have a ruffle. It's about 7 inches long. You could always hack the ruffle pattern piece to be even longer and gather it more, and you'll get an even more full-bodied ruffle. You'll notice that our bodice and pants have a lot of extra roominess and space when they're pulled and stretched all the way wide. That makes it really nice and easy and comfortable for you to be able to get this garment on and give you that extra sort of flowy space in our hips and bodice. But the elastic at the waistline is going to help cinch us in a little bit and give us that natural waistband. The waistband is placed at your high waist. So you have low rise, mid rise, and a high rise waistband. I'd say this is closer to like a mid to high rise waistband. We're using a 1-inch width elastic in our waistband, but some of my pattern testers said they used an even thinner elastic, and that would just give you a little bit different look and feel. The real show-stopping feature of this jumpsuit, I think, are the pant legs. So the pant legs aren't just your typical front and back pant panels. Instead, we've actually got 6 panels per leg. So 3 in front and 3 in back. So there's going to be lots of seams running down our legs. And so for instance, on the pant panel front, we have 2 seam lines that connect all 3 of our panels together. And what this does is it helps our fabric drape and flow a little bit easier, because each of these panels are particularly cut on the grain line of the fabric. So they're all positioned to better radiate out from the waistline with really good swooshy flow to them. And I think that these seams that are running down the pants are really good areas for you to consider adding embellishments like little tassels or maybe little ruffles poking out of those seam lines. These are places where you could really add a lot of drama to the pants. Or it's a perfect opportunity to do color blocking. You might consider doing each pants panel in a different colored fabric, or maybe just all of the outer panels are in a different color. And you could really play around with how this affects the silhouette and overall look of the garment. So those are just a few ways that you could add even more epic drama to your pant legs on the jumpsuit. Of course, pockets always make anything better. So tucked into the side seam of the pants is an inseam pocket. And we're gonna do a specific seam method along the side that helps our pocket sort of flap towards the front of our pants here. The pattern is ready for you to choose between two different lengths of the pants. So you could either do the long flowy pant leg, that's gonna go about to the top of your foot, or there's another line on your sewing pattern that indicates where to cut if you want to do the above the knee length. This is going to fall probably like an inch or two past the bottom of your fingertips. I intentionally made it a little bit longer than like a mini length, just because for me, when I have more flowy legs on a romper, I like the security of having a little bit longer pant leg. I feel like real short, I feel a little bit exposed in my crotch area. So that's why I have it that length, but you could always shorten it up higher or find some sort of intermediate between above the knee and the full floor length. I'll give you a reminder in the sewing instructions of when to try this on so that you can make a more informed decision about how much hem you want to do on the pants so that it's perfect for exactly what you want. All right, moving around to the back of our jumpsuit here. I'm hoping you're gonna love this feature. It was a workaround so that I didn't have to use any clunky zippers or too many buttons. So when you're working with a non-stretchy woven, getting on a jumpsuit this was kind of a puzzle for me to design because you have to be able to get it up over your hips and then still have a nice clean bodice on the back. So what we have here is a button closure at the top with a little button loop. And if we undo that, then you can see these back flaps, they overlap by a few inches down here at the waistline, and then they sort of come out diagonally, and they overlap less and less as they come up, and so they're just touching at the top here at the neck, and we can fasten with the button closure. Let's go ahead and take a look at all of the pieces that we have cut out. For the sew along, I'm going to be doing the full long pants with the ruffle sleeve, and I'm also going to be adding a little bit of faux fray in the neckline by using the selvage edge of my linen. And I'm also going to be doing the inseam pockets. So the pieces that I have cut out are two neckline bias binding pieces. These are cut diagonally on the bias of the fabric. Since I'm going to be doing a little faux fray on my neckline, I have two pieces of selvage edge strips that are cut to the same length as my neckline binding. They are only about a little over a ½ inch wide. Then I have my buttonhole loop strip. After you've cut out your smaller pattern pieces, I recommend that when you set them aside, you just hook them onto a safety pin so that you remember that they're a part of this project and they don't get lost anywhere. I have my two sleeve ruffle pieces, my 4 pocket pieces. Now if you have a fabric that has a right side and a wrong side, then you're going to want to mirror the pocket piece so you have 2 facing in each direction. You might choose to use a lighter weight fabric. I'm just going to be using the same fabric as my main jumpsuit today. Either way, I just like to make sure that I choose a fabric that sort of blends in or matches with the main jumpsuit. Then we have our 2 bodice back pieces. If you have a one-sided fabric, make sure that these 2 pieces are mirrored. Also, make sure that you've marked where they're going to overlap in the back along that bottom edge. And then we have our 2 bodice front pieces. These pieces should also be mirrored. Then we have our 2 pants back panel 1 pieces. And on these, just make sure that you mark on the edges what they're going to be connected to. So for back panel 1, I've marked 2 lines here to mark that on this side, it's going to be lining up with panel 2, and on this side it's going to be matching up with front panel 1, so I just put 1 notch here. Same on my other one mirrored. Same thing for my pants front panel 1 pieces. I've marked 1 notch on the inner crotch side and 2 notches on the outside. This is another piece that's going to be mirrored. All right, I can't even fit them all on the screen, but I have 4 pieces of the pants panel 3, and there's 2 facing one direction and 2 facing the other direction, so they are going to be mirrored. And I've also marked along these edges what panel they're going to be lining up with. So on one edge it'll be lining up with panel 3, and on the other edge it'll be lining up with a panel 2. And then I have 4 pieces of my pants panel 2. This is another one where 2 of them are going to be mirrored with the other 2. And I have marked my edges on this one. So one of the edges is going to be matching up with panel 1, and the other edge is going to be matching up with panel 3. If your fabric is dark enough and you have the right chalk color for it, you might consider making a notation on each of your pant panels just really clearly about what number it is. For my waistband elastic, I want to cut it at a width of my waist measurement minus 1 inch. So my waist measurement is 31 inches, so I am going to cut mine at 30 inches long. I'm using 1 inch knit elastic for my project. I feel it has a lot of stretch. It doesn't bend or fold or twist very easily, and that's why I like it. This is optional, but if you happen to have some lightweight fusible interfacing on hand, it helps to give a little bit of structure to the back flap that's going to button up at the neckline. So I have my 2 strips cut at 1.5 inches wide, and they're as long as my back diagonal sort of center back is. Now, if your fusible interfacing has a sort of stretch to it, like sometimes one way has a little bit of give and a little bit of stretch, and another way doesn't have much stretch at all. We just want to make sure that we're cutting it long ways, not on the stretch. So when I pull this from side to side, this piece almost does not stretch at all. Now in my example here, I'm actually going to take a piece of chalk and just put some crazy squiggly chalk lines on the wrong side of the fabric. That's just because my fabric looks exactly the same on both sides, and for the purpose of this tutorial, I want to make it a little bit more clearer for you about which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side. The right side is going to be the one that faces outward, that everyone can see when you're wearing the garment, and the wrong side is going to be the one that's up against your skin. All right, before we jump into sewing, I'm just going to prepare that center back diagonal of my bodice back. So this is where that fusible interfacing strip is going to come into play. It's 1.5 inches wide, and we're just going to line it up against that raw edge of the center back on the wrong side of the fabric. Now just go ahead and follow your manufacturer instructions for how to actually fuse this to your fabric. Generally, you just want to make sure that the sort of textured glue dot side is up against the fabric. And again, remember, we're putting this on the wrong side of our fabric. What I like to do with mine, this is the Pellon fusible featherweight interfacing. I just come in with my iron and pump some steam into it on the hottest setting and hold it there for about 6 to 10 seconds. Now I'm just going to repeat this on the other side with it mirroring the first one we did. All right, it's time to get to the sewing. Woohoo! Let's go ahead and start to prepare this center back edge. What I'm going to do is start by folding over the raw edge toward the wrong side by 1/2 inch. I'm just going to use my iron to press it as I fold it, and I'm going to repeat this over on the other back bodice piece. Now I'm going to take this long edge and turn it towards the wrong side again by 1 inch this time. I like to use my ruler and just sort of double check that I'm getting it right. And then go ahead and pin this in place. We'll repeat the same step over on our other bodice piece. Now we're going to take these over to our sewing machine, and we're going to do a straight stitch as close as we can to this inner fold right here. So we're going to be going through all layers of fabric about 1/8 inch or less away from this inner fold. Make sure that you backstitch at each end. All right, here's what that looks like finished. Let's take a moment to do a quick trim. If your fold over there on the center back happen to sort of come down further, we'll go ahead and get that trimmed up so it's nice and straight with our raw bottom edge. And then we're going to overlap our two bodice back pieces by a little bit here. So if it matters to you which side is going to be the one that's like opening and closing, then think that through real quick right now. But I don't personally tend to care which side is, you know, flip-flopped over the other one. All that matters really for this overlap is that we want this 1 inch sort of fold over placket area to fall right in between the notches that we marked on the bottom of the opposite piece. So I'm overlapping. They're going to basically crisscross. The one is going to land right in between those two on that one. And then you can see if I peel this one up, that it's also going to fall sort of right in between these two lines right here. Once you've got that lined up and everything is looking nice and straight across the bottom, go ahead and pin that in place. Just about 3 pins is good. And then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and just to briefly keep this overlapped and held together, we're going to run a straight stitch about 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and we're just going to go about as far as we need to. So maybe a stretch of about 5 inches just to sort of tack this overlap in place. But we're only going to go in 1/4 inch from the raw edge so that that stitching doesn't show in our final garment. All right, here's what that looks like finished. Now we're ready to attach our front bodice pieces to our back bodice pieces up at the shoulders. So we're going to do that with right sides facing. I'm going to take my back bodice pieces, flip them over so they are right sides facing up. Then I'm going to take my front bodice pieces and align them with the back bodice pieces up here at the upper shoulder area. So I'm aligning at the neckline and all the way over to the arm opening. Once I've aligned those shoulders together, I'm just going to pin everything in place and then come over here and repeat it on the other side mirrored. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance back stitching at each end. After you've done this stitch, go ahead and protect your edges however works best for your practice today. Maybe you're doing a simple zigzag stitch. Maybe you have a serger and you're able to serge that raw edge, or maybe you have a special stitch on your sewing machine that sort of does a mock serge. Whatever works, just do something to make sure that you keep all of your seams from unraveling and fraying over time. You can see that as I'm running it through my serger, it's trimming off a little bit of the fabric. Ultimately, it's going to bring my seam allowance down to a little over 1/4 inch wide. So if you're doing something like a just regular zigzag stitch on your home sewing machine, or some other sort of faux overlock stitch, you might consider trimming your seam allowance down to 1/4 inch or so, just so you have a little bit less bulk inside your garment, but that's totally up to you. Here's how that seam looks finished. To give this bodice a little bit more structure and professionalism on the outside, the visible side, we're going to go ahead and give a finishing top stitch at that shoulder seam. So I'm going to turn the bodice. I know it's sort of a big floppy mess right now, but we're going to turn it so everything is right side out and locate that shoulder seam there on each side. All right, so here's our shoulder seams. I'm just going to, with my fingers, press that seam allowance towards the back bodice. And then I'm going to come in with my iron and press that. So I'm pushing that seam allowance with my fingers toward the back bodice. And now we're going to come in with our sewing machine with a straight stitch and just top stitch about 1/8 inch away from our original seam line there. We're going to be just tacking that seam allowance hidden underneath. We're going to be tacking it towards the back bodice. Go ahead and back stitch at each end and repeat over on your other shoulder line. All right, here's how that looks finished. It's good practice as you're sewing to come along after every set of stitches and trim off all of the loose threads at the stitching ends. This will just keep your project really neat and clean as you're moving through it and avoid the risk of having sort of nested, tangled threads as we combine things. Now we're going to set our bodice aside for just a moment and we're going to get out our button loop piece. That's our short little stubby one. Now you're definitely going to want your iron handy on this step. With your button loop strip laying wrong side up, we're going to first fold it in half lengthwise. And that's going to help us establish sort of a center crease. Then we're going to open it back up and we're going to turn, this is a really small piece, so bear with me here. We're going to turn the long raw edge on each side. We're going to turn it in towards that center crease we just made, so that that long raw edge is lining up with that center crease. I'm going to repeat that over on the other side. Now be careful here, it's such a small piece and you're so close to your iron. Just be extra cautious so you don't burn yourself. This is where having a really hot iron with lots of steam helps keep all of those tight little folds in place. Now that we have both raw edges folded in towards the center, we're going to come back to that center fold again. So we're going to take it, what we have right here, and we're going to fold it in half lengthwise again. Cinching all those little raw edges inside as best we can. And now we should have a strip with all those raw edges hidden inside, and it should be just about 1/4 inch wide. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch as close as we possibly can to that sort of open fold edge so that we seal everything up. Go ahead and backstitch at each end. When you're dealing with this tiny narrow strip going into your sewing machine, sometimes if you just try and wing it and put it through, it might get sucked down into your sewing machine or have trouble moving on your feed dogs. So a tip I like to suggest is taking just some other random scrap piece of fabric that's a little bit bigger, has a little bit more surface area and can get the traction with the feed dogs. Go ahead and slide that under first. And so it's basically like, you know, butting right up against the piece that we want to sew. That's going to help us towards the back here get that traction we need to be able to move forward. Also, when I'm trying to stitch really close to the edge, I like to move my needle over so that it is aligned closer to the edge of the fabric that I'm trying to sew. And here's what that tiny little guy looks like finished. It's just a little worm. Now I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch button on my garment, and that's what's going to fit inside of my button loop. So if you're doing a button that's any bigger or smaller than that, you're going to want to adjust these measurements accordingly. But for a 1/2 inch button, I'm going to trim my button loop strip down to about 3 inches long. Now using the heat and pressure from your fingers, try and sort of shape that button loop strip into first maybe a C shape until you can really get it to be 2 parallel legs curving at one end. Once you've gotten it pretty close, you can come in with your iron and just press it into place. And we're going to overlap the 2 legs for about the first 1/2 inches. You can clip or pin that in place if you need. Otherwise, I'm just going to take that straight over to my sewing machine and just tack it real quick. You could also use a hand needle and thread if that's a little bit easier for you on such a small piece to just make sure that we are securing this right at that first 1/2 inches. All right, now we're ready to do our neckline bias binding. So I'm going to show you how to do it with the faux fray edge. Now to do this neckline a little bit easier, I've got my bodice laid out so that this is my bodice front, this is my bodice back, and I've got this one continuous half side of the neckline here. Now for my jumpsuit, I am going to be doing the faux fray with the selvage edge piece. So I have these two selvage edge pieces, and they are a little bit less than a 1/2 inch, a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch, sort of somewhere in between there as far as width, and they're long enough to go all the way around this neckline, plus like about 1/2 inch to 1 inch on the edge here. Now we're going to be sandwiching that between the right sides of our neckline bias binding and our bodice pieces here. But our neckline bias binding is cut on the bias, right? So it's cut on the diagonal, which means it has a little bit more stretch to be able to go around these curves more smoothly. When you're using the selvage edge, it really is not as stretchy as your other piece. So just kind of be mindful of that it's going to take a little bit of finagling to get it around these curves smoothly. Just be patient with it, and ultimately you can use sort of like the heat from your iron to sort of mold it all the way around. So like I was saying with the sandwiching process, what we're going to do is we're going to take, with right sides facing, we have our bodice right side facing up. We're going to take the selvage edge, and then we're going to sandwich it with our neckline bias binding, which is going to be right sides facing with that bodice. We're just going to try and make sure that all 3 raw edges are aligned around this curve. You can either use your iron to sort of mold them in place and then pin them, or take it straight over to your sewing machine if you're feeling like a daredevil, and just sort of keep them aligned as you work your way around. What you want to make sure is that you have about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch overhang here, where your neckline bias binding is hanging past your bodice back center fold there. It's hanging past that by about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew all the way around that curve, back stitching at each end. You're going to be sewing through all 3 layers here. So to do just the classic neckline, no faux fray in there, we're going to take our neckline bias strip, and we're going to be aligning it with right sides facing to our bodice piece, and we're going to sort of be curving it around our bodice with those raw edges aligning right on that inner part of the curve. You can either decide to pin this all the way around, or sometimes I just take it straight over to my sewing machine, start at one end, and work my way around. No pins needed, as I'm just aligning those raw edges. But if you're feeling a little bit cautious and you want to make sure that it's nice and easy flowing, if you're more of a beginner, you can go ahead and pin all the way around that neckline. What's important is that you just want to make sure that you have at least about a 1/2 inch of that neckline bias binding kind of extending about a 1/2 inch past our bodice back sort of center fold there. Then we're ready to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew 1/4 inch away from that raw edge all the way around that curve and backstitch at each end. All right, here's how that looks finished. Now, with our right sides of the bodice facing up, we're going to take that neckline bias binding and we're going to fold it in towards the inside of the neckline here. We're going to fold it away from the bodice. And we're going to come in with our iron and press it so that it stays there. Again, in my example, I'm using the faux fray for my neckline, so you'll see that peeping through. If you have any sort of extra spill off in that center front neckline, not the back. Remember, this is our back with our beautiful fold we did here at the beginning. We're going to leave that overhang there by a 1/2 inch, but we can trim down that center front neckline spillover if you have anything there, so that it continues to be just a nice straight line down the center front of your bodice. Let's go ahead and repeat this over on the other side. Now we're going to turn the bodice over so that the wrong side is facing up. We've got all these scraggly raw edges here. We're going to want to enclose them. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to polish up this center back area here. This is our back, this is our front. We're going to take that neckline bias binding that's overhanging at the back area here. We're going to just turn that little bit there back towards the bodice so that we now have like a nice clean folded edge at the center back. Press that with your iron so it stays in place. Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to be adding that buttonhole loop. We want to make sure that we're putting it on the correct side of the back bodice. Is it going to go on the left side or the right side? So I'm just looking at my bodice back straight on now. We have our overlap here, and I want to make sure that I place the buttonhole loop on the side that is going to be on the outer part of the garment when you're wearing it. So if this is the wrong side of the fabric facing up, we're going to be putting the buttonhole loop on the bodice back piece that is on the bottom, or what's going to be on the outside, the outer part when you're wearing it. So we've noted that is this one. So I'll go ahead and make note of that. I'll just put a big X on this side, or you could put a pin or something else to sort of mark the side you're going to be adding it on. Now we're returning our bodice to this sort of flat layout where we just have 1/2 of the neckline. We've marked which side we're going to be adding our buttonhole loop, and so this is where we're going to do it. I'm going to be placing my buttonhole loop lined up with that because we're going to be folding this neckline and tucking in that buttonhole loop, tucking it in for bed. I'm going to be placing it in there so that it's overlapping with my bodice by about a 1/2 inch, and we're going to be double folding this neckline bias binding around the inner raw edge there. So let's start with the first fold. We're going to take our neckline bias binding, this outer raw edge, and we're going to fold it down towards the bodice so that that raw edge lines up with that inner seam line, that first seam line that we made. Use your iron to sort of make things flow real smooth around the curve, and then we're going to tuck our button loop inside there. So as I go around, I'm folding this raw edge of the neckline bias binding, and I'm just having that raw edge line up with that inner seam line that we made first. So I'm going to fold that down, and as I do that, this is a good time to just sandwich in, tuck in your little button loop into that fold. All right, that's going to hold tight just for a second, and then we're going to be going around and doing another fold. So we have this first fold in, we're going to fold again. So now you can see that really nice crisp seam line is peeking through to our wrong side of the fabric here, and we're going to press down with our iron. Now if you did the selvage edge, then you can just kind of let that puppy fly out at this point. Go around that curve with our iron. Now let's check in over here with our button loop. She's looking a little bit floppy. Let's keep her tucked in right there. Working our way all the way around with our iron. Doing that second fold. Pressing real nice and hard. And you can see I've got my buttonhole loop just tucked nice inside there. I don't typically pin all the way around this fold, but I am going to set a pin. if I can, it's pretty chunky. I'm gonna get a pin in there just so that I can make sure that button loop doesn't fly out as I'm putting this through the sewing machine. Now we're ready to take this neckline over to our sewing machine. We're going to sew with a straight stitch all the way around with a 1/8 inch seam allowance, or basically as close as you can get to that inner folded edge there. And we're gonna back stitch at both ends. You're gonna repeat this on the other side, on your other neckline as well, the one that doesn't have the button loop. On that one, you can just back stitch right here, go all the way around and back stitch at the end. On the neckline that does have the button loop, I recommend you kind of start your stitching going this way to secure it, do a right turn, and then work all the way around to this side, and you can just do a regular back stitch here. Here's how those seams look finished with the faux fray edge sandwiched in there. If you didn't have the faux fray edge, it would just look something more like that. So we are ready to add our button so that we can have a fully buttoned button loop back here. I'm going to turn my fabric over to the right side just to show you where we're going to be putting it. It is going to be on the back flap here that is opposite to the button loop, and it's going to be the back flap that when you're wearing this is layered underneath the other back flap, so that we can just hook our loop around our button right here. So I am going to just hand stitch mine since it's just one button. I think that's a little bit easier and quicker. For my jumpsuit, I want it to look a little bit fancy schmancy, so I am using this old, I think it's like a vintage button that my grandma had saved from a garment she got back in the day. And I am going to be using some just regular cotton embroidery thread to put it on there. You could also just use your regular sewing machine thread. I like this because since it's 6 strands, just holds it on tighter with fewer times having to go through the button. And as far as placement of the button, I'm gonna lie my bodice back really nice and flat. See where that overlap is going to take place. I'm going to put my button sort of at the corner of where my neckline seam hits that 90 degrees with my center back seam, and that's where I'm going to place my button. So just make sure you're grabbing, if you're doing hand needle, needle that's nice and strong to get through all these layers if you need to be, because you might be traveling through some neckline bias binding, and nothing special to it. We're just basically going to be attaching our button going from back to front to back to front. When I'm using something thick like this embroidery thread, I'll usually run through my button about 3 or 4 times. Then I'll go ahead and tie it up on that back side with just a double knot. I'll give it a trim so that my threads are about 1/4 inch, so they stay hidden in the back. And here's how my button looks finished. Mine is the kind that sort of has some dimension to it. It pops off a little bit, but no worries if you are using a flat button like this one here. It works perfectly well. This is what I usually use on this garment, is just a flat seashell button right there. And here's how it's going to connect and look with that button loop. It's going to just grab on right there and keep our back closed. Now we're ready to sew our center front seam. I have my right sides facing up on my bodice. I'm going to place my bodice front pieces on top of each other with right sides facing, and I'm going to specifically line up this straight center front edge right here and give it a quick ironing. I'm going to make sure that my neckline bias binding is matching up really clean, and I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way from top to bottom, back stitching at each end. Next, we're going to take that center front seam that we just made. We're going to open up that center front bodice so that the wrong side is facing up. And we're going to go ahead and open up that seam with our iron, pressing each flap of the seam allowance out towards its respective bodice piece. Just a reminder to trim any loose threads. Now we're going to finish this seam with what I think is called a double fold seam. That's what I like to call it. And basically what we'll be doing is we'll be taking this raw edge on each side and we'll be tucking it and flipping it under back towards that original center seam line. So I'll show you what I mean here. So I'm going to be starting with this side over here. I'm going to sort of pinch and tuck or pinch and roll that raw edge under so that it's meeting up with that original seam line. I'm going to follow in with my iron and secure that in place as I go. If you've got a fabric that kind of holds its fold a little bit, you can do several inches of it before coming in with your iron. And if you get really quick at it, you can sort of tuck with one finger and iron at the same time. That's a little bit more challenging. Don't feel bad if you got to come in here and just pinch and tuck, pinch and tuck. It might be a little bit more tricky to get that bulky neckline down there, so just do your best, be patient with it. And then repeat over on the other side. Here's how that looks all folded under. Now we're ready to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch down these folds that we just made. So I'm going to use a straight stitch on my sewing machine. You could start at either end, but you're basically going to work your way down one long fold, stitching as close to that fold as you can get, turning, and then going back on your other fold, tacking it down to your bodice. Wherever you start and end, just make sure that you backstitch. Here's how that looks finished. I have my line of stitching, tacking that fold down on both sides. All right, our bodice is definitely getting there. We're getting closer. This step is for if you're going to be adding the ruffles to your sleeve hemline. I have my two long rectangles that we cut out earlier for our sleeve ruffles. I have the wrong sides facing up, and to start, I'm just going to turn the bottom edge. There is no top and bottom, but just whatever way you've oriented it here, the bottom edge, I'm going to turn up towards the wrong side by about 1/4 inch and press it with my iron. This is going to just start the hem for us and make it a little bit easier later when we finish the hem a little bit down the line. Now we're going to take each rectangle over to our sewing machine and we're going to run 2 long basting stitches across the top unfolded edge of our rectangle. For the basting stitch, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning, I'm going to run all the way down, and I'm not going to backstitch at the end. Instead, I'm going to actually leave like 6 inches of tail thread hanging off here, something that I'll be able to pull later to be able to gather this fabric up. For each basting stitch, we're going to run them parallel to each other. We'll do one at a little under 1/2 inch and one at 1/4 inch from the raw edge. Just remember, you're going to be backstitching at the beginning, no backstitch at the end. We're going to repeat that same stitch on our other sleeve ruffle piece, and I'll show you over at the sewing machine. You want to put your machine settings on the longest stitch length. All right, let's bring our bodice back out, and we're going to place our bodice with right sides facing up. Orient ourselves with our sleeve. So this is my bodice front, this is my bodice back, this is my shoulder seam here. And I'm going to be adding my ruffle right along this raw edge right here. So I'm going to be wanting to gather up this ruffle so that it meets up with the exact length of my sleeve raw edge, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do right now. What I like to do, because I'm doing all this on a soft ironing board, this ruffle piece is right sides facing with my bodice. So I have my wrong side facing up. And I'm going to take the end where I did do my back stitch. I'm going to align that with one end of my bodice. And I like to pin that to the bodice, but I'm not just pinning it to the bodice. I'm pinning it to the bodice and I kind of hook it in and back up through my ironing board cover. This is just a quick tip for you, totally optional, but it helps me sort of anchor everything in place as I go to pull those threads. Then I'm going to do the same thing over here on this edge. This is my loose thread end where I didn't backstitch. And I'm going to line that up, and right at the edge corner there, I'm going to pin that in place. I'm pinning it both to the bodice and my ironing board cover so that everything's sort of stuck in place. I couldn't pull this off my ironing board if I wanted to. So then the last pin I like to place here for the moment is going to be a few inches off, a few inches to the side of my bodice here. That's going to go through just my ironing board cover, and that's going to be an anchor pin for us to sort of hook our threads onto once we've pulled them. Now, we have our loose threads over here where we didn't backstitch, right? I'm going to take just the top two threads, the ones that are coming up off the top of the fabric. Leave those bottom threads behind. They're just going to lay down there, chill out for now. And I'm going to take these two threads and I'm going to start to gently pull them while I sort of hold the fabric with my fingers, and I can start to move this gathering down so that it starts to evenly spread. And as I'm pulling those two threads, I don't want those threads to break, so I'm doing it pretty gently and starting to move my ruffle all the way across. And eventually what I'm trying to get to here is so that the full length of my sleeve ruffle is the exact same length as the raw edge of the sleeve down below it. I want these ruffles to be relatively evenly spaced. These two ends here, they're going to be basically at our underarm side, and it's also going to be where our seam is to connect everything. So I probably won't put much ruffling within about an inch or so of my two ends here. I'm going to keep most of my ruffling spaced evenly though throughout the rest of our width here. And once I think it's looking the right length and everything, I can take the threads that I've been pulling and holding on to, and I can do a little figure 8 wrapping around my anchor pin over here that I put into my ironing board. That just helps make it now so that everything is held in place on my ruffle at this nice perfect length with my sleeve. That way now I have my hands free to be able to pin and iron, press everything into place and get it ready to take over to the sewing machine. So let's do just that. I'm going to come in with my iron, and I like to just press, squish down onto everything. Use lots of steam, get it into place. Then I'm going to come in with a pin every few inches. And this time I'm not going through my ironing board cover anymore. Now I'm just going through the fabric of my garment to secure my sleeve ruffle with the bodice. Then I can remove my anchor pins here that's holding it onto the ironing board, replace them because I still want that sleeve held to the bodice at those points. And I can also remove my anchor pin way down here. I'll take that guy out. And I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to change my thread length back to normal. Then I'm going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down, making sure that my seam falls sort of right inside of our basting stitches here so that they don't show in the final garment. And we're going to back stitch at both ends. Then I'm going to take this over to my serger and protect this raw edge right here. You could also do zigzag stitch or binding or whatever suits your sewing practice today. Then we'll go over to the other side of our bodice and repeat all of these steps for our other sleeve. If you're going to protect the seam with a zigzag stitch, you might find that the 1/2 inch seam allowance is a little bit bulky on the underside of your sleeve. So you could always trim this down to 1/4 inch and then protect your seam with your zigzag or faux overlock or however you're going to manage. And if you are using a serger, I often do this anyway because I find that my serger has a hard time going through thicker areas like this sort of ruffled up part. So I'll often just on something like this, just to be safe and not frustrate myself too much over at my serger, I'll just go ahead and like manually trim this seam allowance with my scissors so that when I take it over to my serger, I don't actually have to use the knife at all. I just serge right up along the edge. All right, here's what that looks like finished. But we're not fully done with it. We want it to look really nice and clean and flat on the other side of the garment. So what I'm going to do is flip my bodice so that it is right sides facing up. And I've got my beautiful ruffle here, but I want it to lie really nice and flat at the seam line. So I'm going to, with my fingers, sort of work that seam allowance that we just made on the back side. I'm going to push it up towards the bodice or towards our sleeve bodice area, away from the ruffle. And once I've got it positioned there, I'm going to press with my iron, nice and flat. And then we'll take this over to our sewing machine. And with a straight stitch, we're going to stitch all the way along that seam on the side of the bodice, back stitching at each end and just stitching as close as you can, about 1/8 of an inch away from that original seam line we just made. Go ahead and repeat those steps over on your other sleeve ruffle as well. Here's what that looks like finished. Now we're ready to basically complete our bodice by stitching our underarms and sides. So we are going to, with right sides facing, we are going to layer our bodice front on top of our bodice back, and our underarm seam is going to be a curve right here, and your front and back should line up perfectly. Some key points we want to make sure are definitely aligning are the little folded hem of our ruffle, the seam where our ruffle meets our bodice, and the bottom edge here of our bodice. I like to get all of those things aligned, place a pin in each location to get me started. Might come in with my iron, sort of make sure I work all of those curves so that they're the same length on my bodice, front and back. And then I'll come in and place a pin every couple inches. After pinning, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and stitch all the way around from the distance from my bodice waistline all the way to my sleeve hem. If you're doing the short sleeve version, it's also going to run all the way to your short sleeve hem here. And I'm going to make sure that I backstitch at each end. This is going to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We'll repeat all of these same steps over on the other side of our bodice. After stitching, you just want to protect your seam by doing a serge or a zigzag stitch. Here's what our bodice currently looks like when it's wrong side out. Now we're ready to finish our sleeve hems. So if you're doing just the short sleeve or if you're doing the ruffle sleeve, same step here. Basically, we're just going to finish off that sleeve hem by folding it one more time. For our ruffle sleeve, I'm going to turn it under 1/4 inch, just like we had initially. We're going to do another 1/4 inch turn there. If you're doing the short sleeve version, you are going to turn it another 1/2 inch. But I'm doing the ruffle sleeve, so let's go ahead. Turn that hemline up towards the wrong side of the sleeve, come around and press it in place with my iron. and I'll work my way all the way around. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch as close as I can possibly get to that inner fold that we just made. That'll probably be an 1/8 inch or less from that inner fold. I'll be stitching all the way around and back stitching at each end. Repeat this step over on your other sleeve as well. And here's what it looks like finished on the right side of the garment. Woohoo! All right, we finished the bodice and we're ready to set that aside while we go ahead and start working on our pants. All right, now we're ready to start working on our pants. So we're gonna wanna stay organized and pay attention to the markings we made back when we cut out our pants panels. So like on mine, for example, I had marked on each edge what panel each panel is going to connect up with. I might have kind of a hard time fitting my panels into the screen for the video here, but I'll try my best. But basically, what we want to pay attention to is that we're connecting our panels 1, 2, and 3 together, and that we're mirroring it for the other side. So I'm going to start with just doing my pants fronts. So I've got my front panel 1, I've got a panel 2, and I want to make sure, because if you see here closely, I have 3 lines marked here, which means this should be linking up with panel 3, not panel 1. And a 1 on this side. So I want to flip this one over. Or for you, if you have a fabric that has a clear front and back to it, then you want to make sure that you're just grabbing the correct one. And this one, my panel 3, it says it's going to line up with panel 2, so that's perfect. So I have my 3 panels here, and then over here I'm going to mirror everything. So I have my front panel 1 mirrored with my front panel 1 over here, and then I'm going to put panel 2 here and panel 3 here, making sure that panel 1 is lining up to the correct side notated on panel 2. If you have enough space, it's kind of nice to have your front left side and your front right side laid out in advance, just so you can kind of see what you're working with and making sure that everything is going to line up in the right spot. So I'm going to start with this set of 3 panels right here in front of me, and what we want to do, I have them all right sides facing up right now. We're just going to connect each panel to the one next to it at these 2 seams here, one between our front 1 and panel 2, and between panel 2 and panel 3. I'm going to just place panel 1 on top of panel 2 and line up that long raw edge. I'm going to pin that in place, and then once I've done that, I'll kind of fold this back so I have a little bit more room, and then I'm going to put panel 3 on top of panel 2 and align that long raw edge, pin that in place. Then we'll be taking it over to our sewing machine, and we're going to be sewing this whole long length here to connect panel 2 to 3, and we'll also sew this whole long length between panel 1 and panel 2. We're going to stitch it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and just be sure to backstitch at each end. After you've pinned together all of your front panel pieces, go ahead and repeat these steps on your back panel pieces. I like to get all of my pant leg combinations prepared for the sewing machine all at once. So I'll go through and pin the front right, the front left, the back right, and the back left, and have that all prepared and combined. And then I'll take all 4 combinations of the pant leg pieces over to the sewing machine and then just run through all of my stitches at once. With each of your seams now sewn, we just want to protect that seam. If you have a serger, go ahead and just run each of these seams through your serger. If you don't have a serger, you could zigzag stitch, or you could open up the seams and do the same sort of finishing that we did on the bodice center front, where you basically open up the seam and then you flip each raw edge in towards that original center seam line. That way you're sort of encasing all your raw edges into a fold. And I think that can give you a really clean seam finish as well. For mine, I'm gonna take mine over to my serger. All right, what a marathon. I've got all of those seams we just made. It should be 2, 4, 6, 8. You should have 8 seams that you just created and protected. And now we are going to go ahead and press those seams. So I'm going to take each of my 4 new pants combo pieces here, and with right sides facing up, I'm going to press with my fingers to try and get each of the seam allowances pointing in the direction towards the crotch. Then I'm going to come in with my iron and press everything nice and flat. So I'll show you real quick from the back side. We have the seam allowance here, and it's now pressed towards the crotch side of the pant leg. I'm going to repeat that on my other 7 seams, just using my fingers to sort of start off by just pushing and manipulating that seam so it's pointing consistently in the direction I want, and then pressing with my iron. Then I'm going to take this back over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch all the way from top to bottom of that seam, staying about 1/8 of an inch away from that original seam line. This is basically just going to be tacking down our serged seam to our pants so that everything stays laying nice and flat when we go to wear it later. Woo! All right. Are you in a trance fully now from sewing that many straight lines in a row? I definitely feel like I am. But it really adds a nice, polished, finished, high-quality look to your pants. So I think that was worth it. Hopefully you agree. And this is what that seam looks like finished. All right, now adding inseam pockets is totally optional. You can skip right past this step if you want to. But if you would like to be adding some inseam pockets to your pants, then we're going to want to grab our 4 pocket pieces. And then for each pants piece, we want to locate that pocket mark that was indicated on the pattern. That's going to be on like your panel 3, your outer side panel. And you're going to grab 1 pocket piece and align the top edge of it up with that pocket notch or mark that you indicated up there. We are placing the pocket right sides facing with the pants, and we're going to align the raw edges over here. I'm going to grab my pins and place 3 or so pins along that edge. Then I'll take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to do a straight stitching. I'm going to sew from the very top of this pocket straight down to the bottom of the pocket. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance and backstitch at each end. Then, to protect this seam, just this seam right here where the pocket's hitting the pants, I'll take this over to my serger, and then without trimming any fabric at all, I'm going to run a line of serging from about like 1 inch above my pocket down to about 1 inch below my pocket, just to make sure I've really protected that area well. Of course, if you don't have a serger, you can also protect this seam with a zigzag stitch or whatever's in your sewing mojo today. We'll go ahead and repeat these exact same steps for all 4 of our pants pieces. Here's what that looks like finished. We have our pocket bag right sides facing with our pants, and we have sewn from here to here, serged to finish that edge. Now what I'm going to do is, with this finished edge here, still pointing out away from the pants, I'm just going to fold this pocket bag back, and then I'm going to press it out and away from the pants so that both the pocket and the seam allowance are being pushed and pointed away from the pants. Then I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to top stitch here from the top of this pocket, straight line all the way down to the bottom of the pocket, back stitching at each end. I'm going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line there so that it'll be tacking the seam allowance to the pocket. Then I'll go ahead and repeat this same step on all 4 pant and pocket combos. Here's what that looks like finished. And you're probably going to have a lot of little thread tails hanging off at this point. So make a note to go around with your scissors and trim all the starts and stops of your pockets where you've got little doodads flying off. All right, once you're all trimmed up and all of your pockets are attached and top stitched, then we're ready to attach the front of our pants to the back of our pants at the side seam. All right, we are ready to start attaching our pants front to our pants back at the side seam. If you skipped doing the inseam pockets, you're going to rejoin us here. So everyone is going to be doing this step. We are going to grab our pants back and our pants front. If you ever lose your notations and you can't for some reason remember which side is the pants front and which is the pants back, the pants front usually has a much shallower little crotch triangle here. This is pants front versus pants back when they're coming straight down. So I know this one's my front and this one behind it is the back. All right, so we're going to be placing our pants front piece right sides facing with our pants back piece. And what we want to align here is the side seam, your pocket if you made one, and all the way down that side seam. So I like to sort of use my fingers to get everything to kind of rake the fabric into place so I can see all my raw edges are aligned on that top and bottom layer. Then we'll go around and pin everything in place. So if you don't have the pocket bags here, you're just going to pin all the way down that long side seam there. If you do have the pockets, you're going to pin at the top here, then you're going to pin all the way around that pocket curve, and then turn here, you're going to pin down this long stretch as well. All right, once it's all pinned, we're going to go ahead and take this over to our sewing machine. If you're not making the pocket, then super simple, you're just going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the top here at the waistline, straight down all the way to the bottom hem of the pants. Back stitching at each end. Once you've done that straight stitch all the way down, go ahead and protect that seam with either a serge or a zigzag stitch. If you are doing the pocket, it's still simple, it's just going to have a couple extra turns in here. So I drew on here in white chalk where we're going to be making these turns. Depending on how you placed your pins, like on which side and how you're entering the sewing machine, you're either going to be approaching the pocket from up here at your waistline or down at the bottom hem. Doesn't matter either way. All that matters is that you just get these turns around the pocket. So also, I'll show you, for example, if we're coming from the waistline, then we're going to stick with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to sew straight down until we're about 1/2 inch past the start of our pocket. Then we're going to do a right turn, and we're going to keep that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to stitch all the way around that pocket, all the way around that curve. And once you get back to approaching the pants here, you're going to turn, sew in towards the pants by about a 1/2 inch. All right, so now you're going to cross the threshold of the previous seam allowance stitching that we already made here. You're going to make a right turn, and you're going to head all the way down to the bottom until you reach the bottom hem, and you're just going to back stitch at the very end. If you're coming from the direction of the bottom hem, you'd be coming up this way. You'd make a right turn about a 1/2 inch after the pocket bag starts, turn in, curve all the way around the pocket, 1/2 inch seam allowance still, cross that threshold into the pants by a 1/2 inch, take a right angle turn, and then you're just gonna finish up that final bit of your pants up here, backstitching at the end. After you've sewn all the way around your pocket, we want to go ahead and still protect this seam all the way around. So we can take it over to our serger or our zigzag stitch, however you prefer. And we're just going to go around that seam allowance to protect it. Now, if you're using a serger, just make note that when you get to these right angle turns, it's going to be crucial that you don't cut into your pocket with your pocket knife. So just go slowly, sort of work your fabric around when you get to those curves on your serger. I believe in you. You got this. Then you'll just repeat all of those same steps over on your other pant front and back combo. All right, over on my serger, I'm going to try my very best to protect these edges while also going around these sharp corners. So let's give it a try. All right, here's how that looks finished. All right, so now we have that side seam. But now we want to do one more thing to finish that seam and make it look really polished. So let's flip our pants over with right sides facing up here. And this right here is my seam, my side seam with my inseam pocket right there. Now, whether you did the pocket or not, what we want to do here is push that seam allowance toward the front of the pants. So I can see from my previous markings, my faint little B over here, that's my back side. Just remember that if your notations have worn off, you can always remember by looking at the crotch point here, and the crotch point that sticks out the furthest is the back. The more shallow one is the front. So with our right sides facing up, we want to push the seam allowance we just made toward the pant front, including the pocket if you made one. So I am going to flatten everything out, straighten it out, and with my fingers, I'm going to first sort of get my pocket nice and flat underneath. Then I'm going to go along this seam and just use my fingers to turn that seam allowance so that it's pointing towards the pant front. It's going to be laying underneath the pant front. Then I'm going to come in with my hot steamy iron and I'm going to press that seam allowance, including the spot where my pocket is, if you have one. I'm going to press that seam allowance so it's really nice and flat, and you can see the seam allowance is pointing towards the pants front. Then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and do a top stitch. Now, if you didn't do the pocket, you're just going to run your top stitch nice and simple from the top of the pants waist here all the way straight down to the bottom pants hem, doing a back stitch at each end, and we'll make that stitch about 1/8 inch away from that original seam line. So it's going to be going through your pants front fabric and your seam allowance. Now, same thing for if you added the inseam pockets, but we don't want to sew our pockets shut. So my pocket opening starts right here. So I am actually going to do my top stitch down to about 1/2 inch below where my pocket opening starts, or 1/2 inch past. Here's where my pocket opening ends. I'm going to resume my top stitching at least 1/2 inch to 1 inch before where my pocket opening ends, and then continue that top stitch all the way down the length of my pants to the bottom hem. I say 1/2 inch to 1 inch here. All that really matters is that you can fit your hand inside of the opening. You don't want it to be too gaping of an opening because things like your cell phone and wallet might fall out. And so that's why I like to just kind of ensure that it's going to be a nice comfy space for your hand, but has enough kind of closure to it so that everything that's in this pocket bag doesn't just fall right out. You can mark your pocket opening boundaries ahead of time with chalk or pins so that you remember where to start and stop. All right, we'll take this over to our sewing machine. Then you want to repeat these same steps over on your other pant leg, making sure again that you're pushing that seam allowance towards the pant front. Here's what that seam looks like finished. All right, now we're ready to sort of start preparing the hem of the pants. So whether you're doing the shorter version or the longer version of these pants, the hem is going to be set up the exact same way. We are going to start by just turning our pant hem under towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/2 inch. So I've done a 1/2 inch hem so many times, but don't feel shy about getting out your ruler if you need to double check what a 1/2 inch looks like. And I'm just working all the way around with my iron, folding up by a 1/2 inch as I go. Because I'm using linen and a really hot steamy iron, this fold generally just kind of holds itself in place for the most part. If you're using something a little bit more slippery or doesn't hold a fold as much, you might consider using just a few pins along the way to hold it in place before we move on to the next step. Then we'll repeat this 1/2 inch fold over on our other pant leg. Now we're actually not going to do anything else with that fold for the time being. We're just gonna set it and forget it for now, and we are going to move on over to sewing the inseam of our pants. So that means we're going to be joining pant front to pant back. So we're still staying within one sort of insular unit here of, one sort of pant connected to back with one pocket bag here. So what we're not doing right now is combining our two pant units together, our right leg and our left leg. We're just sticking with one of these that we've got made up where we did the side seam already. Now we're going to be sewing the inseam right here, so from the hem of the pants up to the crotch. And we want these pieces to be right sides facing. And I'm going to align those raw edges, like I said, between the crotch point here and the bottom hem of the pant. I like to sort of just use my fingers to kind of comb the fabric in the direction I want it to go. Sometimes because these are cut on diagonals or curves, maybe one piece got stretched out when you were pulling it at a certain stage of this. So they should be the exact same length. If you need to kind of tug a tiny bit at one, or maybe like use your iron to kind of press together anything that might have stretched out on another one, go ahead and do that because you want these to be the exact same length. They started the same length, so you shouldn't be like cutting any part off. Just do your best to manipulate the fabric back into place if something got stretched out. Now take note that we are keeping this fold down here in place that we made earlier. That was the start of our hem. We're going to keep both of those folds on the front and back right there and line them up. Give them a pin, and we're going to pin this whole distance. Then let's take this over to our sewing machine. We'll stitch from the crotch to the bottom hem of the pants with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Once you've got that seam in, we'll want to protect the seam allowance here. So take it through your serger or a zigzag stitch or a French seam, however you are finishing your seams today. Then repeat these steps for the pant inseam over on your other pant leg. Here's what that seam looks like finished. All right, we're getting so close. Now we just need to combine our two pant legs with our crotch seam. So to do that, we are going to take one of our pant legs, it does not matter which one, and we're going to turn it right side out. Then we're going to take our piece that's turned right side out and we're going to actually insert it into the tube of the pant piece that is inside out. So I am through basically that crotch curve and that open waist area up here. I am inserting one pant leg into the other. Get it kind of in there, match up some of your corners, give it a shake, let everything settle in. Now our two pant legs are right sides facing each other. That's just where we want them to be. We need to match up some key points here. Let me show you from this angle where we're going to be matching everything up. You can see here, this is our inseam of both of our pants, and we want to match up those inseams from each pant leg. So I'm going to line them up so that they are going in a straight line right there. But then to reduce bulk, I'm actually going to push one of the seam allowances in one direction, the other seam allowance in the other direction. And then I'm going to pin them in place. And another key point that we need to match up is up here at the tops of our U shape, up at kind of the waistline of the pant. And then everything else, we want to sort of wiggle into place, and we want to fully align the raw edges of this U shape right here. So I'm going to come around with pins every few inches. And something to keep in mind is that your two pants pieces should be the exact same length for this distance. And so again, if you feel like one of your pant legs has gotten stretched out on this curve for whatever reason, you might just come in with your iron and sort of heat it back up, try and squish it back into shape. Remember that at the beginning, these all started at the exact same length, and so you should never be like trimming at the top because one got out of shape. You just need to sort of mold it into position. All right, and once you've pinned all the way around your U shape here, we are going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're gonna stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way from the top of our U shape, down and around, back up to the other end of our U shape. We're gonna back stitch at each end. Then to protect our seams, go ahead, like the rest of our seams, we're going to take it to our serger or a zigzag stitch or however you're finishing your seams. Here's what that seam looks like finished from this angle, or from the more traditional kind of pants angle. It's going to look like this, with our two pant legs still tucked inside of each other. Our last step for our pant is to prepare our waistline to be able to connect these to our bodice. So first, you can come around and trim off any loose, crazy threads that are flying off. At this point, we can turn our pants so that they're not shoved inside of each other. I'm gonna do mine so that they are completely inside out. Both pant legs are now loose and free. Everything's connected. So exciting. Now what we want to do here is we want to clean up this waistline real quick before we attach this to our bodice. So if you have a serger, you're just going to serge all the way around this waistband, not trimming any fabric whatsoever. You're just going to kind of pick a spot, start, work all the way around, trail off in that exact same spot you started. If you don't have a serger, do the exact same thing with a zigzag stitch or a faux overlock stitch, whatever you've been using for the rest of your seams. Here's what that looks like finished. And if you're thinking about skipping this step, please do not. This is going to be an exposed seam in the finished garment, so you want to make sure you've got it nice and protected. Again, no fabric was trimmed off in this process. All right, we're in the home stretch, peeps. This is so exciting. We are actually going to bring back our good old friend, the bodice, and we are going to be attaching our bodice to our pants. So one thing to check for real quick here is my bodice about the same width as my pants? Let's start there. It doesn't matter if it's inside out or right side out or what have you. I just want to double check how far off are my pants from my bodice, because no matter how accurate my pattern is or how accurate you were at cutting, there are 12 panels on these pants, which means every single slight difference in seam allowance or stretching that has happened possibly 12 times, and that can really add up. So your pants might end up a little bit smaller than your bodice. They might end up a little bit bigger than your bodice. Your bodice likely has a little less error in it because you had fewer seams. Hopefully you got that overlap correct. It should be the closest thing to accurate for your size. Do note that the bodice back is going to be just a little bit wider than your bodice front. That's normal, that's okay. Same thing for your pants. Your pants back might be a little bit wider than your pants front. That's normal, that's what we want. It's also okay if they're exactly the same. We just want it to be consistent on the pants and the bodice. So as I'm kind of looking at mine, I just want to make a judgment real quick about, are they the same? They are pretty close to the same. I think I maybe was a little scant on my pant seam allowances, and so my pants are just a hair bigger, wider than my bodice. If you're feeling like it's really close, then you can always just kind of give your bodice a little bit of a tug like we've done in some previous steps. And in that same vein, you can kind of try and manipulate the fabric of your pants to sort of squeeze back together. Maybe they got stretched out a little bit more than your bodice did from all this sewing. And so if you can just like by hand manipulate them to be the same, that's great. If they're feeling way off, then I'd say your first line of business is to go to the pattern instructions and check out the finished garment measurements. You'll want to check out the measurement of the fully stretched out waistband and see what that measurement is and see if that lines up with what you've created here. That's what you want to kind of end up with, and maybe you'll have to make adjustments in one way or another. But if you're feeling like one of these is way off, your pants ended up somehow way too wide or vice versa, then the good thing is with this elastic waistband, we're already going to get lots of sort of like tucks, puckers, I don't know the right word, but it's already going to get real kind of like wavy and messy in here anyway, in a good way. And so if you need to be able to adjust your pants, let's say, to get smaller to meet your bodice, you might consider just sort of doing a slight little pleat in a couple spots. Maybe you only need to take it in like a 1/4 inch. Maybe it's 1/8 of an inch, something small. Make sure that you're mirroring it on your right and left pant leg. Another important factor here is that the side seams of your pants are going to match up with the side seams of your bodice. So ultimately we want the bodice front to be the same width as the pants front. So make sure that if you're taking in little bits and sort of making little pleats on your pants front, make sure that it's going to line up with your bodice front. Okay, so like I said, I think mine is pretty close, which I'm feeling proud of. That's good. I'm the expert here, right? Sometimes though, you never know. Things go wrong for me all the time too. So don't feel bad if yours is way off. But I think I am ready to attach my bodice to my pants fully as is. So I'm going to leave my pants inside out. I'm going to leave my bodice right side out. All right. Now on my pants, this is really important. You want to fully double check what is your pants front and what is your pants back at this stage. All right, so I know for me, some telltale signs of what is my pants front is that my pockets the seam allowance is pressed and stitched towards the pants front. I can see over here on my seam line that is true. So I can label this is my pants front, back here is my pants back. Another way you can tell is sometimes you can see if the crotch, when the waistline, remember that back crotch, is longer, the pants back crotch is longer, and so if your waistline's lined up here, which side does our crotch point hit at? You can see that mine's sort of falling on the front. That means pants back is on the back side. Any other notations you made for front and back work great. I just don't want you to put your bodice on your pants backwards. I have done that before for a customer. That was very sad. So we got our pants front all sorted out. We know that this is our bodice front. We are ready to attach our bodice to our pants. The way we're going to do that is we're going to take our bodice and we're actually going to insert it into our pants with right sides facing, and we're going to line up our raw edges. So see what I'm doing here? I have my bodice laid out with my pants inside out. I'm going to rotate my bodice so I've got its raw edges here. Got my pants raw edges there. Both my pants front and bodice front are on top. I am just going to insert my bodice into my pants. Insert the bodice all the way in. And now you can see my bodice is tucked right inside there. So I've got my pants all the way around enclosing my bodice here. Now I want to align some very key main points here. The front center, the back center, side seam, and side seam. We are going to come in with our pins and making sure we have the center front of our pants lining up with that center front seam of our bodice. I'll pin those in place. I'll grab my side seam. Make sure that it is lined up with the side seam of my bodice. Other pant side seam matched up. And then the center back of my bodice lined up with the center back of my pants. You might not have a mark indicating the center back of your bodice, but we have overlapping flap and we can gauge there's probably like an inch or so in between those two thicker placket flap pieces, and that's where I'm going to mark my center back. I'm going to line that mark up with center back of my pants. All right, and now we've got ourselves started. So we can start working away around with pins, getting everything lined up. So it'll be the raw edge of the bodice, should be aligned with the serged top edge of our pants. And again, you might find that there's just slight discrepancies between maybe your bodice width and your pants width. What matters is that we have those side seams and center front and back lined up. From here, if it's just a minor difference, you might find that just kind of giving a little bit of a tug on your bodice or your pants, whichever one's shorter, can help you just sort of ease it into the same width, falling flat with the other piece. I'm working all the way around, adding pins every 3-ish inches. Now in a moment we're going to sew all the way around this waistline here, but we're going to be sewing it with an 1.5 inch seam allowance. That's way bigger than we're used to. So something to pay attention to is on our bodice back, if 1.5 inches up where our seam is going to come through, if our bodice is kind of like accidentally folded in some way or it's not lying flat, then it's going to give us some trouble in the finished garment. So just double check before we sew the bodice to the pants, just double check that that back overlapping flap is lying kind of in the direction that you want it to. And you might add a pin, you know, a few inches up just to make sure it's being held in place and not gonna wiggle around like a crazy buffoon on you. All right, so like I said, we are going to be taking this over to our sewing machine and we're gonna sew all the way around this waistband with a 1.5 inch seam allowance. So that's 1.5 inches away from that raw and serged edge up there. Over on my machine, I kind of have it marked off like how far the fabric should reach for it to be an 1.5 inch seam allowance. But you could also come around with your ruler and a piece of chalk or a pencil or something and just mark 1.5 inches all the way around so that you know exactly where you're going. That's one way to do it. Otherwise, if you have a way on your machine to kind of make sure that this edge is, you know, guiding you at 1.5 inches. Another thing to note about this 1.5 inch seam allowance is just that things might get kind of shifty on you as you're going through your sewing machine. Your pants might start kind of going this way and your bodice starts twisting the other way, and things are no longer lining up 1.5 inches in like they were back where you put your pin right here. So you might consider doing a second row of pins here just before you even head over to your sewing machine, using your fingers to kind of pinch the bodice and the pants seams and kind of feel, okay, are they aligned right here, you know, by like 2 inches up? And come in with your pin and actually just make sure that they're aligned all the way up here as well. This is really just important at our key points, our center front, center back, and our 2 side seams. Once I've got those pins kind of reinforced further down on our seams, I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. Again, it's a 1.5 inch seam allowance, back stitch at each end. You're going to work all the way around. Notice here that things are starting to kind of bubble up on me, like it's showing that my pants are a little bit bigger than my bodice. So I'm going to do that kind of pinch and pull method again, where I grab kind of both layers and I'm going to just kind of gently pull so that that bottom layer of my bodice gets stretched out just enough to lie flat with the top layer of my pants. It's just a slight manipulation of the fabric here. And if you get a slight kind of like pinching of the fabric and it's not going in and it doesn't go in completely flat, honestly, unless it's major, do not sweat it. It's going to get kind of hidden into your elastic waistband scrunchies anyway. All right, so here is that seam finished. And now is the perfect time to turn this whole jumpsuit right side out and actually try it on. I know we don't have that elastic waistband in yet, so it's going to look a little bit floppy on your body. But most importantly, we want to make sure that you like the distance from your shoulders to the waistband and to your crotch. So I'm going to turn mine right side out and I'm going to try it on just to make sure that when it's on my body, it's not giving me a wedgie from my crotch point based on it being pulled on my shoulders. All right, so I am trying mine on right now and I'm loving the length. That's going to be great for especially when I'm wearing heels. And I am checking out my bodice. I went with the lower neckline here. The more conservative neckline would be a couple inches higher. Anyway, that aside, I'm looking specifically right now at how comfortable I am with the distance between my shoulder and my crotch down here. For me, it's feeling good. There's a little bit of room, I'd say. I know this is like an awkward movement, but there is about a couple inches kind of leeway down there, and that feels comfortable. It doesn't feel too low. It feels like I have enough room so that when I raise my hands over my head, I'm not getting any wedgie. It does hug my butt, but just in the right way, not in like an uncomfortable way. If I were to sit or squat, everything feels good. It feels flowy. It feels roomy. So that is what you want to check, is do some tests here. Raise your hands above your head, do a squat, do all sorts of body movements that get you feeling the feel of this. It's not going to feel totally comfortable yet. What's going to help is when we add that elastic waistband right here, it's going to fall right under our like breast line. That elastic waistband is going to help everything kind of feel secure on your body and not like a huge flowing potato sack. So promise we'll get there. We're getting close. All right, so perhaps you tried this on and it didn't feel long enough from shoulder to crotch. It was giving you big wedgie energy. That's no good. A couple things that could have happened there. Maybe you didn't use the height adjustment calculator. You're taller than this pattern was intended for. It's intended for someone who is 64 inches tall. On your next iteration of this, do try and use the height adjustment calculator to add some length to your bodice. But maybe you use the height adjustment calculator and it just still didn't give you enough. All of our proportions are, sometimes a little bit different. A calculator on the internet is only going to get you so close. So let's say it still feels too short. Something that you can do to adjust is we're actually going to end up cutting this bodice part of the seam allowance down to a 1/2 inch anyway. So really, we have a lot to spare here. We have about 1 inch that you can add to the overall length of this garment. It's going to be adding all the length to your bodice, but if you're all right with that proportionally, then you're good to go. What you want to do to make that adjustment is you're going to just rip this seam out that we just made, the one that went all the way around back when your bodice was tucked inside your pants. Go ahead and rip that out. I know it sucks, but put on a good song and rip your way through it. Take out all of your aggression on these seams. Then when you're back at this stage and your bodice is tucked right sides facing with your pants, and make sure that your front is again aligned with the front of your pants. Don't put anything on backwards. Once you have that tucked inside again, what you'll want to do is, instead of aligning the raw edge of the bodice with the serged edge of the pants, I'm not going to undo mine, so sorry, I hope this isn't too confusing, but make a mark around your pants on the right side of them. That's about 1 inch or however much more you need. Maybe you only need to add a 1/2 inch. Maybe you need to add a full inch. Whatever it is, go ahead and mark a line all the way around 1 inch or 1/2 inch, whatever it ends up being, all the way around your pants. And then instead of lining up your bodice raw edge with the serged edge, you're going to line the bodice raw edge up with that new line that you drew in there. You're not going to trim the pants anymore. You're not going to cut off that serged edge or anything. You're just going to line up the bodice raw edge with that new line that you drew below the serged edge. Now, I do not think that you should do anything more than 1 inch here. That's about as much wiggle room as we have, because when we're still going to do the 1.5 inch seam allowance. And by 1.5 inch, I mean 1.5 inches on the pants. You're basically just shifting this shirt, the bodice piece, up, but you're going to be leaving the seam allowance the same, the 1.5 inches on the pants. So hopefully that makes sense. Email me if it doesn't and you're completely lost, but that should get you about an extra up to 1 inch on the full length from your shoulders to your crotch. All right, so we've tried it on and we're liking that length from the shoulder to the crotch. Then we want to come in here and we're going to grab just the seam allowance flap from the bodice. So this is the one that doesn't have the finished serged edge. We want just that raw edge seam allowance of the bodice. We're going to come in with our scissors, and I know it seems scary. We're committing. We are going to trim just the bodice seam allowance down to a 1/2 inch. And I'm trimming all the way around. Make sure, be very conscious of where your scissor blades are going, that they're not trimming into anything you don't mean to be trimming. And just to reiterate, we are not trimming the seam allowance flap of the pants. I'm just kind of rolling that, tucking that out of the way for now while I trim the bodice seam allowance. I'm even trimming through that chunky overlapping flap there. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We're doing roughly a 1/2 inch here, but ultimately this is all going to get hidden. It doesn't even have to be that pretty. It doesn't have to be perfectly a 1/2 inch. Eyeball it. All right, so here's where we're at with that. We've got this shorter 1/2 inch bodice seam allowance, and then we've got our longer 1.5 inch pants seam allowance. Now we're going to turn our garment completely right side out for a moment. Now from this side, what we're going to want to do is we'll be pushing both seam allowances, all the seam allowance at this waist, we're going to be pushing it up towards the bodice. And so I can kind of feel around with my fingers that all of that seam allowance right now is pushed up towards the bodice. It's layered underneath just the bodice. That's the pant seam allowance too, is also pushing up towards the bodice. I'm going to come in with my iron, press it nice and flat, flip my garment over, do the same thing on the back side. And then yes, after all that work of just turning it right side out, we are going to turn it inside out again. We can see all of our seam allowance is still pressing up towards the bodice. That's great. That's right where we want it. And the pants seam allowance, the one that's nice and protected there at the edge, is completely covering our bodice seam allowance. So that's great. This is going to become the channel where we actually insert the elastic into. And so what we want to do is pin that pant seam allowance to the bodice. But it's going to be tricky here because we have kind of all 4 layers. We have pant seam allowance, bodice, bodice, other pant seam allowance, all layered right in this area. So just diving a pin through can be a little bit hard to fish just the right layers. What I often do is I grab some kind of tool like this plastic ruler, and I will insert it into my bodice like this, so that it kind of acts as a barrier between my layers. So that way when I go to pin, I'm fishing through just the pant seam allowance and the bodice. The pin kind of bounces off of my ruler and it won't catch anything else. So you could try that with like a piece of cardboard or even paper, just something to help you separate your layers here a little bit as you work around. So basically all I'm doing is I'm just going to be pinning this seam allowance up towards the bodice all the way around. Then we're going to be taking this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch down that pant seam allowance to the bodice where we just pinned it. We're going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that serged or zigzagged edge. But instead of going all the way around, we want to leave a little space here for us to add in our elastic waistband, because this is the elastic waistband channel. So let's say you start stitching right here. You're going to stitch all the way around, stop stitching about 1.5 inches from where you started, back stitch at both ends, and then we'll come back and we'll add in our elastic together. All right, here is what that seam looks like finished. All right, we are on our last final steps here. This is so exciting. We're just adding in our elastic to our waistband. So I've got my 1-inch elastic cut to size, which the size should be your waist circumference minus 1 inch. And what I like to do with my elastic is I like to take a pencil or a pen and just mark the top what is the same side, so that when I feed this through my jumpsuit, as it goes all the way through and around, I want to make sure it never got twisted. And so I know that if I'm attaching these at the end with both pencil marks face up, I know I'm good to go. So let's start with that. We'll make a marking on our elastic. Then I'm going to grab one end of that elastic with my safety pin. And I'm going to start to feed this elastic through the channel. Doesn't matter which direction you go, just follow your heart. And I'm going to start to push that safety pin and its tail of elastic all the way through this channel here. Just be cautious as you're going that you aren't getting it twisted. Pay attention to your tail end of your elastic, that it's not getting sucked all the way through and that you lose it. So just make sure that this guy, stays sticking out an inch or two so you can find it at the end. Woo! All right, I've made it through. I can identify here on my elastic, once I take my safety pin off, I can see my little line that I drew is still facing up, and the one going in is got that line facing up. So I'm just going to layer those two lines right on top of each other. I like to overlap my elastic, and by about, I'd say it's probably about an inch or 3/4 inch. I'm just going to keep it in place with a simple pin. Take it over to my sewing machine, and then to secure these two ends together, I'm just going to do a bunch of zigzag stitches up and down to make sure that this becomes one long continuous loop of elastic. Once we have our elastic all sewn together with that zigzag stitch, we can kind of weasel it back into that waistband. We'll get our elastic more evenly distributed throughout that waistband. And then our very last step is just to sew up that final little hole that we inserted the elastic through. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I am going to continue that stitch that was about 1/8 of an inch from the serged edge. I'm going to continue it just to seal up that hole. And it's your choice what sounds easier, but sometimes it looks a little bit cleaner if you do it actually with the right side facing out, because that way you can make sure that you actually start and stop your stitching perfectly in line with the rest of the waistband stitch line. All right, here's what that waistband looks like finished from the outside. You can always adjust it so you have a little bit more floof in the front or back, wherever you need it. Now we're ready to actually finish our pant hem. So again, this is for the shorter version of the sanctuary and the longer version. If you remember, we did a 1/2 inch fold already on our bottom hem here. Now we're going to finish this hem by folding it again towards the wrong side of the garment by 1 inch. We'll use our iron to press it in place. So I'm going to work my way around. And you could be adding pins as you go, or you could do all your ironing first, then come through with your pins. I'm dropping a pin about every 3 or 4 inches. All right, once you have it all pinned up, then we can take it over to our sewing machine. And we're going to stitch all the way around our circle here, stitching about 1/8 inch, or honestly as close as you can get to that inner fold as you stitch all the way around. I like to start and stop my stitches at my inseam because I feel like that's like the least visible part of the pants, and so any back stitching that I do right here is going to be less visible. So I'll probably start and stop my seam right here, go all the way around, back stitching at both ends. Then you'll repeat all of these steps over on your other pant leg. Here's how that pant hem looks finished on the wrong side of the pants. And here's how it looks finished on the right side of the pants. And you did it! What?